We've all seen the person, or even been the person, that has like the lean legs, the lean upper body, the lean arms, but then just a protruding belly, just a lot of fat around the middle, or even just a pot belly. Well, is that worse than being just flat out obese and very overweight, generally speaking? Well, the biggest issue with having a pot belly or high amounts of visceral fat is not just the fat itself. It's actually how it impacts our metabolism. And there's some brand new data that we can look at. Now, I'm not just gonna spill a bunch of data on you. I'm going to give you practical, pragmatic solutions for how we can counteract this newer research. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first study. So this study was published at the end of 2022. It was published in the journal Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. And it took a look at over 10,000 people. So they were looking at genome-wide associations between visceral fat, between subcutaneous fat, and between a couple other things like inflammation and whatnot. Now they found that although higher BMI, more body weight, more body fat, although that did lead to higher levels of insulin, what they found was that what was more correlated with insulin was waist circumference. In fact, waist circumference had 2.43 times the negative impact on insulin and insulin resistance than BMI did in general. So what's alarming about this is that someone could be very lean, but if they have a bigger belly, that is what is indicating potential metabolic issues. Well, that's kind of surface level, and I think a lot of us can wrap our heads around that. But we need to uncover some more data, because what about people that are just flat out obese, but could be metabolically healthy, right? Could that actually exist? Well, we'll get into it. What this study ultimately discovered is that visceral fat could be the key cause of insulin resistance, not subcutaneous fat. In fact, what they found is that the higher the amount of visceral fat, the higher the amount of insulin resistance. They also found that the higher the amount of visceral fat, the higher the amount of stored belly fat would come thereafter. You see, here's what happens. Visceral fat elevates the insulin levels for whatever reasons, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then these high levels of insulin impede our body's ability to burn fat effectively. So then we start storing it more. So if you had one tool that you could use to identify sort of the beginning of a metabolic decline, it would probably be getting a DEXA scan and seeing your levels of visceral fat. Because you can be lean, but have a high amount of visceral fat, and you could potentially catch that before it starts leading to central adiposity and more actual belly fat. There is a difference between what you and I think of as belly fat, which is like the soft fat you can grab, and what visceral fat is inside the actual abdominal cavity surrounding the organs. My simple point in saying this is we need to make efforts to reduce insulin and reduce visceral fat, and that could help us out in the future. But I'm going to dive in more. I'll give you a few tips right now before I get into all the nitty-gritty of it. Okay, increase your fruit consumption instead of refined starches. Replace refined starches with fruit. Okay, do some aerobic activity. Reduce your stress. Replace as many of the fats in your diet as you can with monounsaturated fats. Okay, macadamia nuts, olive oil, avocados. Okay, take some notes on that, but we're going to get more granular as we go on. But now we get into the weird paradox here. Okay, we've talked a little bit about how you can be a lean person but still be unhealthy. How can you be an obese person but still be metabolically healthy? Well, this is a difficult thing to talk about right now because we have the whole body positivity movement where we're really divided in two very solid camps. So people that think that's the right way and people that think that's the wrong way. But if we look at a paper that was just published in 2022 as well in Nature Reviews in Endocrinology, we see something that the researchers called metabolically healthy obesity, which sounds crazy. How can you be obese and be metabolically healthy? Well, the caveat here is that most of the time when there is severe obesity, there is not metabolic health that goes in tandem with that, okay? Metabolically healthy obesity is the outlier, it is the anomaly, but it can exist. Basically what can happen is when we have subcutaneous fat, just the surface level fat, okay? That fat can actually be functioning fat, or it can overflow. When that fat overflows, it overflows into visceral fat, and it can overflow into other organ tissue like the heart and the liver. That is what happens most of the time, and it is hugely problematic. So most of the time when you have severe obesity, you also have visceral fat, okay? But there are situations where people have adipose tissue that can handle the storage, so they don't have an inflammatory issue and they do not overflow. It's an exception to the rule, but it does exist. What we're starting to realize here is that in the last couple of years, insulin resistance problems and these metabolic issues that cascade from insulin resistance start at visceral fat. So if we can control the visceral fat, we more than likely can control the metabolic issues, okay? So we have to understand why this is happening, and then we have to get into the practical tips. There was a study published in Medicine that took a look at 600 obese people, okay? And they took a look at visceral fat area, subcutaneous fat area, and a couple inflammatory markers. And ultimately what they found was that the more the visceral fat area, the more C-reactive protein and the more overall inflammatory molecules were elevated in a very clear linear fashion to the surface area or the total area of visceral fat. Basically what this tells us is that this white blood cell activity, this inflammatory activity that's associated with more visceral fat, triggers an inflammatory response that stands in the way of insulin doing its job properly, potentially leading to insulin resistance. How does inflammation affect insulin resistance? Well, if you have an insulin signal, think of it as a row of dominoes. Okay, these dominoes, you knock them over, they have a nice, beautiful line that gets knocked over. Inflammation, it's like it pulls out a couple dominoes, so the whole system just gets corrupted. And then this signal from insulin cannot reach the actual cell, the insulin receptor, and you are left with metabolic dysfunction. So if you are obese, then certainly that obesity can lead to a spillover leading to more visceral fat. But also, if you are lean and not obese and you have visceral fat, you have a clear warning sign that could be dealt with before you become generally obese or honestly worse, metabolically deranged. How do we fix this? First thing is very cliche, limit the sugar intake. Now, I will say losing weight in general is probably going to be the best thing that you could possibly do. If you lose total body fat, you will probably lose visceral fat too. But there are ways to lose more of a percentage of visceral fat. And sugar intake seems to be correlated with visceral fat. Okay, unfortunately, it kind of sucks to hear. But specifically things like high fructose corn syrup. There were studies that looked at subjects that consumed more in the way of sodas and high fructose corn syrup beverages and foods, and they had much higher levels of visceral fat. Sugar ultimately desensitizes our insulin receptors. It desensitizes the entire insulin process, right? So the more sugar you take in, the more insulin resistant you become, the more visceral fat you can develop. It's all a big circle. If you need some ideas and just healthier habits, I put a link to our sponsor down below. It's called Thrive Market. Before you skip over this section, hear me out on this because it's pretty cool. They're an online membership-based grocery store, but that is a 30% off discount link right below this video so that you can get 30% off your entire grocery order. The reason I mention this is because you can select sugar-free items, you can select low carb, you can select keto, you can sort by whatever diet type you want to follow and literally do your grocery shopping that way. Like you can see in comments on other videos that people say that Thrive has changed how they shop. I definitely recommend it. If you have trouble going into the grocery store and identifying the right kind of stuff for what you're doing, this is the answer for you because it is done in a way where you can filter and make it easy. That link saves you 30% off your whole grocery order plus a $50 free gift. And I stand behind the products that they carry, the lack of processed garbage that's in their shop, everything that they do, plus sustainable meat and seafood options as well. So that link is down below, right below this video in the first line of the description. The next thing that you have to pay attention to, and it sounds so simple, is fiber intake. Before you skip over this section, make sure it's soluble fiber intake. Insoluble fiber is beneficial, don't get me wrong, it's definitely not detrimental, but the benefits really come from the soluble fiber. There was a study that was published in the journal Obesity. This is so wild. independent of BMI, so independent of how obese someone was or their total BMI, more fiber led to less visceral fat. As a matter of fact, it was connected that 10 grams of soluble fiber increased in the diet daily led to a 3.7% reduction in visceral fat. You know how easy it is to get 10 grams of soluble fiber? We're talking maybe like a couple tablespoons of flax seeds. We're talking like maybe a couple tablespoons of chia seeds. Get those Flackers crackers, those crackers that are made out of flax seeds. Okay, a little bit of psyllium husk, a little bit of Metamucil before bed. Realize how easy we are talking, right? And this has a huge effect on your body overall. But when we see this correlational data, it's hard to ignore. Okay, yes, it's going to impact how much you eat because you'll be more satiated, but probably more importantly, it's impacting the gut microbiome and that entire pathway and signaling system that helps regulate visceral fat, helps regulate fuel utilization, glucose and fat utilization. The next one is doing a specific kind of cardio. Here's what's wild, is we are in this age where everyone is touting resistance training. Don't get me wrong, clearly I enjoy resistance training, and I think it is insanely important for the metabolism and for the muscle. But when it comes to reducing visceral fat, the research just doesn't show that resistance training does much there. Does it mean you shouldn't resistance train? No, you 100% should. But cardio is what's going to take off the visceral fat more than likely. So a study was published in Obesity Reviews, took a look at 35 papers, and it found that cardio, aerobic exercise, was powerful at reducing visceral fat. Resistance training had practically no effect. Then another 9 studies they looked at combined resistance training and cardio. There was no additional benefit to adding the resistance training to the cardio when it came to visceral fat. Now, when it comes down to other things, 100%. Trust me, you need to resistance training. But if your goal is reduction of visceral fat, you might want to focus on the cardio. But there's even more good news because there was a study published in the journal Physiology. And this demonstrated that higher intensity bouts of aerobic exercise were more effective at burning visceral fat. So you don't have to spend a ton of time. You can do things like 1 minute on, 1 minute off, 1 minute on, 1 minute off for like 10 or 15 minutes total and be done. Whoop, out, get out of the gym, back to home, right? Okay, the reason is because we have more glucocorticoid receptors in our visceral fat, so a high stress stimulus from cardio is going to be effective. Additionally, you're burning more calories in a shorter amount of time. That's clearly important. But also, the spike in growth hormone that you get from a high intensity bout of cardio like this, that has a big effect on hormone-sensitive lipase and the ability to ultimately burn fat. So you might burn more fat overall, but you're also going to burn more fat as a percentage within the visceral fat region, which is tremendous. The next thing you need to do is you need to focus on getting sleep, which is so easy to say, okay? And I understand that. We all struggle with sleep. But here's a few simple things that you can do. Okay, for one, something like tart cherry juice 2 or 3 hours before bed. That can help increase melatonin levels without having to pop a melatonin pill. Maybe take a tryptophan supplement before bed. That might help you create more melatonin naturally. If you really get hungry at night, maybe have a scoop of unflavored or unsweetened protein powder an hour or so before bed. Another thing you can do is cut the carbohydrates out 3 hours before bed. That can make a huge difference. Okay. Another thing that you can do is you can try to allocate your higher intensity exercise to earlier in the day and maybe try your lower intensity exercise later in the day so adrenaline isn't spiked and you can get good quality sleep. And lastly, try to get some red light or some full low light exposure in the morning like Dr. Andrew Huberman talks about and kind of sets the circadian cues right for our cellular sort of chronobiology so they know the cycle and when it's time to go to sleep. This can impact your visceral fat levels tremendously because the correlational data points to it. So sleep, fiber, lower the sugar, replace a lot of your carbs with fruit, things like that, high intensity interval training, and get a DEXA scan and see where you're at. I'll see you tomorrow.